horror movies suck nowadays. The whole genre, it's dead. God, it's down the tube. Except it's not. They actually make plenty of good horror films, and most of the ones that you think are the death of the genre are actually just mediocre. And this is not a new trend. This is something that has been going on since the beginning of the genre, basically. There has always coexisted good, bad, and examples of horror. What we're currently experiencing is a trend of what I like to call jump scare exploitation. Jump scare exploitation is basically very kind of soft-core horror movies that don't have a lot of legit threat going on, but put a lot of focus into that's what the kids are into right now. They like their jump scare movies. I think a lot of the Conjuring universe movies are a big part of this genre right now. And I'll admit, I'm not a big fan of a lot of these movies, like especially the Conjuring movies. Even the better movies of the Conjuring universe, like it should just be like the Conjuring 1 and 2 are probably the more critically acclaimed ones. But even the better ones, I'm not a big fan. I haven't been. But that doesn't mean that they're the worst movies ever made and the horror genre is dead. These are just movies that are not made for your old ass. These are made for teenagers primarily. These are teen horror movies. And this dates all the way back to the 50s. Go back to the 1950s when the horror genre was making a shift from sort of like gothic horror into the atomic age of cinema. Nuclear monsters and space invaders. Kind of the drive-in makeout movies, I guess what we'll call these. These are movies that often were pretty mediocre, just made with the intention of teenagers going to the theater to make out. And then occasionally maybe pay attention when the monster's on screen. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people, old people at the time, were like, these aren't real horror movies. Back in the good old days when we had Dracula and Frankenstein. Which, yes, those are good movies, but so is The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Or Godzilla. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Those would be good examples of the atomic age right there. But for every like one Creature from the Black Lagoon, there was like probably 50 Attack of the Giant Leeches. Which I think we can agree is a bit more downscale in quality. Or hell, how about The Beast of Yucca Flats? You ever seen that one? If the answer is no, keep it that way. It's garbage. Just total crap.
Mom, we saw some real pigs.
Yeah, and a coyote.
Coyote?
Yeah.
Don't you be playing with coyotes. Now, come on. We're leaving. Come on.
Oh, we never get to have any fun.
So I could imagine being an old-timer, seeing movies like The Beast of Yucca Flats coming out and be like, they don't make good horror movies anymore. But at the same time, they're probably forgetting that, like, in the 30s and 40s, you know, we had, like, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, good movies, but there was plenty of crap coming out back then, too. But the 50s really began what I like to call, like, the teen horror movie. These are movies directed towards teenagers. And that's probably why the old-timers were such a fuddy-duddy about it. And then you go, skip ahead, 60s and 70s, kind of like grindhouse cinema, which is, again, garbage crap. But, you know, this is also an era where you're getting the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or The Exorcist. After, like, the atomic age in the 50s, I think the next big era of teen horror is when we skip ahead to the 80s, when you got the slasher movie craze.
My Bloody Valentine.
And again, we have quality films from this genre. I think, you know, Halloween, that was late 70s, but it's still sort of part of this era. That's probably like the peak example, if you want to include it. There's also Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. You know, there's like good films from this genre, but then there's a sea of crap. I think a more middle ground slasher movie might be like Madman, which is on a technical level very well made, very atmospheric, but kind of has a very basic plot. Like, there's nothing really complex. I kind of like appreciate that it's so simple, it's almost like beautiful to me, but I can imagine some people being like, this is just tired garbage, it's just making the same movie over and over again. And yeah, that's how the teen horror craze works. You just make the same movie over and over again, but you tweak a few things, and it keeps them entertained. It is specifically catered to an audience that is not old and jaded. They haven't seen a million movies. They've only seen like a small spectrum of things, so they are cool seeing the same crap over and over again until the craze dies out, and then a new flock of teenagers is ready to see whatever crap you got for them. This is very rambly. I don't know if any of this is making sense or if I just sound like an insane person. Yeah, whatever. I don't really know where I'm going with that. And then the 90s brought on a kind of tweaked version of the slasher craze, where the 80s slashers were a little bit more gritty, rough, had a lower budget feel. 90s got kind of more to the later end of the 90s, brought on the, like the clean, polished slasher movies like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, some other ones. This genre really kind of defined 90s horror, but I feel like it didn't really go on as long as we think it did. Like, most of the 90s was stuff like Leprechaun.
Say, aren't we a little young to be out this late?
No, I'm 600 years old.
Self-aware parody slasher movies. The stupid cat wants in. Like, the funny thing about the 90s slashers is a lot of people kind of like to say, like, oh, like Scream, that ruined the horror genre. Everything just sucks after that. Like, were you paying attention to, like, the first half of the 90s? Was Leprechaun really your golden standard? Probably not. But you're not paying attention to the fact that that's what horror was throughout most of the decade. Right at the end, movies like Scream came out, and regardless of if you're a fan of that type of horror or not, it did revitalize the genre. It boosted some life into it. It made it hip with the teens again. Horror seems to thrive when teens are into it, because, I don't know, teens love to go to their horror movies, but you gotta have, like, the hip, cool horror movies. Teens are not gonna go and watch Creature from the Black Lagoon in the year 2022 or whatever. It's not gonna happen. Unless they have, like, an acquired taste for that sort of thing. I did when I was, that age. I've always loved older films, but most teens don't. So you can be an old man and say, oh, this ruined the genre, sucks, everything's dumb now. But odds are, whatever you grew up with, that's what the previous generation said ruined the genre. Did you grow up watching 80s slasher films like Friday the 13th? Well, then there's a good chance your parents were like, we grew up with different things. We grew up watching the 50s sci-fi movies. Those were real horror movies. And then before that, the generation was like, we grew up watching Dracula, Frankenstein. Those are real horror movies. They're all real, guys. They're all real, and a lot of them are real mediocre. But it's fine, because in the sea of mediocrity, there are golden pieces of gold. So you kind of had like the teen glam slashers of the 90s at the very end, which quickly transitioned into the torture porn genre. That's what my teen years were, watching those kinds of horror movies. I actually remember seeing Hostel 2 in theaters and had a great time, even though, once again, old fuddy-duddies were like, these movies are trash, they're just way too extreme violence. And then the 2010s came along, there's barely any violence in horror movies, and it's like, where's all the violence at? It's an endless cycle. Nobody's ever gonna be happy, except for the teen audience, because they just kind of accept what's being presented as the new thing. So now we're in the early years of a new decade, the 2020s, and by the end of it, maybe there'll be a new genre that will be like the hip teen thing that old people hate. I don't know. We'll see. We'll find out. All I wanted to say is quit making YouTube videos where you're complaining about how horror movies suck nowadays, when in reality, crap has always existed. It's not new. It's not new, guys. So yeah, thanks for watching. I think I've kind of rambled enough. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because that's what you're supposed to do as a YouTuber. I'm supposed to tell you to do these things, because then you'll be more likely to do it. Kind of running out of breath. Let's end this video.
Science couldn't explain it, but there it was, alive in the deep, deep waters of the Amazon. A throwback to a creature that had existed 100 million years ago, immensely strong and destructive. A woman's beauty, the bait that brought it out of its lair. See underwater thrills never photographed before. See Titanic under